Hello and welcome back. This week's lecture is going to be covering chapter 23. So we're jumping over chapter 22, which is dealing with plants. We'll hit that next week. So we're going to take a look at the diversity of fungi. We're going to talk about some of their general characteristics and then go over some examples of different groups of fungi, just like we did with the protists last week. Okay, let's get started. All right, so what we're going to do in this lecture, we're going to talk about the key characteristics of a fungi, what makes a fungus, what are the major groups, and we'll go through all of those different representative examples. We'll talk about how fungi interact with other species, plants and animals and humans, and then we'll finish up with their specific impacts on humans. So let's take a look at what makes a fungus. So key features, they're eukaryotic, which means they're going to be part of our eukarya domain. So we've gone through now protists and now onto fungi. They're multicellular, mostly multicellular. There's a few single-celled ones, like yeast is an example of a single-celled fungi. A lot of times when we talk about fungi, we think about mushrooms, but only a few types of fungi actually produce mushrooms. So the mushroom is just the fruiting body. It's a reproductive structure of something more complex that's usually found underground. They make up a network of tissues called mycelium. So we can see in the picture up here, I'll get my laser pointer going. So all of this fine hair-like structure collection and matted together is what we call mycelium. If we zoom in on a little section of the mycelium, we'll see that it is made up of even smaller fibrous structures called hyphae. And if we're to zoom in on the hyphae, we can see they're just long kind of tube-like collections of cells. So they're multicellular. They do have plasma membranes, all the same stuff we have with eukaryotic cell membranes. They do have cell walls, but their cell wall is actually made out of something called chitin. It's a K sound, not chitin. Chitin. It is actually the same macromolecule that insect exoskeletons are made out of. So it's kind of cool to see that crossover between something that's clearly an animal and something that looks and kind of behaves like a plant. So fungi are kind of somewhere in between your animal kind of heterotrophic chitin cell wall, like we might see in an exoskeleton of an insect, but they're stable, they don't move around, they look like they could be plant material, but they don't photosynthesize. They consume other nutrients. So kind of a weird in between an animal and a plant, I guess, a planimal, if you will. Nutrition, as I just mentioned, they're heterotrophic, which means they consume other organisms, but they do not ingest. So when we're talking about animals or some of our protists, ingestion is kind of consuming and taking that food into your body for an internal digestive process. Fungi are heterotrophs, but they're heterotrophs in a way that they secrete their digestive enzymes into the environment around them, do all the digestion externally, and then they will absorb those broken down nutrients. So for example, starch is a large molecule made up of a whole bunch of individual glucose molecules. So if we were to ingest starch, we have all of our enzymes or amylases inside of our guts and stuff that's going to break that down, and we absorb the glucose along our digestive epithelium. If you are a fungus, you would secrete your amylase enzyme into the environment, break down the starch, and then absorb the individual glucose molecules. So that's the major difference. They're both heterotrophs. They're getting nutrients from other organic material. One's ingestion, one's external digestion. Okay, so I covered that. Material and nutrition. Reproduction, kind of like protists, some can do it asexually, some can do it sexually. It just depends on the environment, environmental conditions that's going on. Usually if it's a stable, everything's good to go, the organisms will just continue making copies of themselves. So the mycelium are haploid, they'll just mitosis, they'll make some haploid spores, the spores will get released, land somewhere else, and start making some haploid mycelium. Sometimes you can get some fusion of opposite sexes. They're not really male and female in the fungal world, as you'll see in some of our life cycles coming up. They're called plus and minus, so just different versions of this genetic information. So sometimes in a sexual reproduction process, you'll get two haploid nuclei of the plus and minus variety fusing. They make a diploid zygote, rearranging all of their genes, right? So crossing over, independent assortment, recombination, all of that stuff gives you your haploid gametes that have new genetic combinations, and then they will release their spores and they will grow into the haploid mycelium. So your mycelium are pretty much always going to be haploid, and you're only going to get that short little diploid zygote stage before it turns right back around and goes through meiosis to make that haploid spores and mycelium. So let's take a look at the major groups of fungus that we're going to take a look at. So this is the cladogram from your textbook. So we have what are called chytrids, rumen fungi, belasticlades, glomeromycetes. See, in my A&P brain, I want to say glomerulus. I want to put an extra L in there. Basidiomycetes and ascomycetes, and then more of their scientific names in parentheses. Those are too hard for me to pronounce, so I tried to put the more common terms over here on the bullet points. And then there's kind of a leftover group that doesn't really fit into those 6 main categories, and they're classified kind of informally as zygomycetes. So let's start our journey through our different groups of fungi. So the first one are the chytrids. So these are mostly aquatic. They have a flagellated spore, so they need a watery environment to reproduce or to kind of disperse after they've been released from their parental mycelium. Some of our oldest known fungi fossils are found in rocks about 600 million years old. So these fungi have been around for quite some time. Their major focus is to feed on dead aquatic plants or other debris, animals, dead animals, organic material. They are decomposers, right? Sometimes they can be parasites of plants and animals. But what your book talks about is they can actually, they're actually part of a major decline in amphibians in our tropical environments. So amphibian populations are getting more susceptible to chytrid infection. Then we have our rumen fungi. So if you took Bio 102, you may or may not remember all of the different compartments of a ruminant's stomach. We did talk about the different bacteria that can be found in these chambers that help with breaking down of cellulose. We have some fungi that also do the same thing. So they live in the rumen, and that is where the plant material, the cellulose material comes in, and along with the bacteria, the rumen fungi help to break down that cellulose to release those organic nutrients that then the fungi can use, as well as the ruminant, the cow itself. All right, and we have Belasticlades. So these are structurally unique in that there's this cap. So this is a picture from your book kind of blown up. So we have this distinctive cap here, this nuclear cap. These organisms tend to live in water, fresh water and soil. Some can be parasitic, and they have spores, flagellated spores. So again, they're going to need to be near water for them to carry out their reproductive processes. The next group are your glomeromycetes. These organisms produce really intimate relationships with plant roots. We're going to see this benefit later, called mycorrhiza. They reproduce asexually. Still not clear if there's sexual reproduction observed, but they are a big part of this symbiotic relationship to help plants benefit from the environment around them. So associate glomeromycetes with beneficial root symbioses. Now getting into types of fungi, I don't know why I quoted fungi, that you might be familiar with is a group called Basidiomycetes. So these are the typical, you see a mushroom in the grass, it's most likely going to be a Basidiomycete. You see a shelf fungus on a log if you're walking through a forest, or a puffball, most likely going to be a Basidiomycete. So these are where we typically see mushrooms, is this fruiting body. It's the reproductive structure of the underground mycelium is the major structural component of that fungus, and then only releases the mushrooms when it's ready to release its spores during reproduction. This pattern here, you may have seen this out in like park lawns or maybe in your own lawn. It's called a fairy ring. So the way that we have this in this particular pattern is a spore might have landed in right here on the grass, like right where my laser pointer is, and the mycelium spreads. and then it goes through its reproductive cycle and pops up its its mushrooms, releases those spores, and then the mushrooms die off. And that mycelium continues to grow outwards away from that center spot. So maybe now the mycelium's out here and it's ready to reproduce, and it'll pop up its mushrooms, releasing its spores, and the mushroom dies. And now it's going to build more mycelium in a bigger circle, all right? And then it's going to pop up its mushrooms and it's going to release its spores. So the bigger the fairy ring, the older it is, because it's almost like tree rings. As those mycelium grow further and further outwards, the middle ones might die off. And so you're only getting the mushrooms where you have the living mycelium, and they continue to spread every time they release their spores. So it's kind of cool. You could age a fairy ring by seeing the circumference, diameter. By seeing the diameter of this circle kind of tells you how old that fairy ring might be. It's probably all the same organism underneath the ground. It's just popping up its little mushrooms for reproduction. And here is a life cycle. So basidiomycetes, how they do their sexual reproduction in this case. So we're going to start with step 1. So we have, again, negative and positive. We don't really have male female in the same context that we see in other sexual reproduction. So let's say the male, as I just said, there's a male. So the negative is the blue, the positive is the red. So their hyphae are just kind of chilling, growing next to each other. They produce a mat of mycelium. They're all kind of interwoven. They form a mushroom, right? The mushroom is the reproductive structure. The gill caps underneath, if you've ever, looked at a gill cap of a mushroom underneath, next time you're at the grocery store, pick up one of those big portobello mushrooms and you'll see those nice gills underneath. So they produce these little structures here called basidium. That's the name, that's the naming origin of basidiomycetes. And so your two haploid nuclei, the red and the blue, will fuse. That's the sexual part. So you have two different genetic combinations fusing together to make a diploid nucleus, and it will quickly go through meiosis to produce 4 haploid gametes, these spores. And so now the reason why we do this is it's going to exchange that genetic information. That's the whole point of sexual reproduction, to get some diversity in your organisms. So then off of these little basidiums, they will pop off their little spores and then grow into their haploid hyphae and become mycelium of their own. All right, the next group are ascomycetes. Again, this is another one you might be familiar with, especially if you like morels. So basidiomycetes are the main ones you're going to associate with mushrooms, but we commoners also would call a morel mushroom, even though it's not quite of the same technical category. So ascomycetes, sometimes called cup fungus, because they produce these little cups. You can see the kind of little cups here in the body of the morel mushroom. So we also include the organisms that produce penicillin is an ascomycete. Your bread molds would be like an ascomycete. No, bread molds are different, sorry. So here is, just like we talked about the basidiomycete life cycle, ascomycetes, again, very similar. Here we can actually take a look at the asexual cycle. So the plus version, just reproducing the haploid spores, grows into a hyphae, grows into a mycelium, and it'll just kind of keep on growing through mitosis. If there are 2 different forms, a plus and a minus coming together, they will actually come together, produce plus and minus mushroom, or the fruiting body. This big mat of mycelium growing up into the fruiting body, which we would typically call a mushroom in our lay terms. And then instead of a basidium, these produce an ascus. Again, ascomycetes, basidiomycetes is based on the shape or the structure of these sexually reproducing things. So again, you fuse your plus and minus to get a diploid nucleus. It will quickly go through meiosis to produce 4, get your haploid nuclei, and then they divide by mitosis to give us 8. So that's kind of a key feature of ascomyces, or 8 little spores that then get released and grow into their haploid hyphae. So very similar life cycle process of sexual, kind of fusing your nuclei, then very quickly going through meiosis to make your new genetically diverse haploid spores. And then our last kind of doesn't quite fit into any of their categories group of mushrooms are called the zygomycetes. This is our bread mold as an example. So here again we have your Asexual reproduction, just spores are being released. They grow into hyphae and they grow into spores, and so just kind of going through this process here. If we wanted to do follow an asexual reproduction, same type of thing. You've got your different forms, plus and minus. They meet by growing together into this little zygosporangium. Of course, there's new words for everything. You're going to get the fusion of the nuclei, like we've seen before. We're going to get that quick meiosis, producing your haploid spores. So it's going to grow into this nice little stalk. At the top of the stalk, we have our little haploid spores. They release, and we're back to growing the haploid hyphae. So hopefully, as you see, we're going through these different life cycles, very similar reproductive processes in the haploid hyphae, the sexual reproduction, a quick nuclear fusion, and then the meiosis right after that. All right, so those were all of our different representative groups of fungi. So now we're going to take a look at how fungi interact with other species. A lot of it is symbiotic in that they both benefit, like a mutualistic relationship. We'll talk about lichens here in a little bit. So a lot of times they're beneficial. Sometimes they're parasitic, like the chytrids that we saw earlier. We're going to see, oh, I just lost the name of it, the one that grows on the insects. Cordyceps is coming up a little bit. We can see some parasitic relationships. So symbiotic, either beneficial or harmful to the hosts or the fungi themselves. So this is the picture of lichen, and lichen is a combination of the fungi, which is your kind of the gray structure here. This is the hyphae, and then you're going to have some kind of photosynthetic partner. This could be algae, this could be a photosynthetic bacteria, but the key thing is it's photosynthesizing, and your fungi aren't, right? So they can't make their own food. So by coming into a symbiotic relationship with an organism that can, like photosynthesize, it provides the housing, the photosynthetic organism provides the food. It's like somebody's paying the rent and somebody's buying the groceries. Right? So here's some representatives of lichens that you might see if you go walking, even on a trail, sometimes even downtown, you might see some lichen kind of stuck to a rock or stuck to a telephone pole or a tree or something like that. The fungal members provide the shelter, right? So they're paying the rent, and the photosynthetic partners provide the food, so they're buying the groceries. But the fungus takes most of the groceries. They eat most of that food, up to 90% sometimes, leaving a little bit left over for the photosynthetic organism, so it's not quite even. But then the photosynthetic organism has a nice, secure place to live, so maybe it's a good trade-off. There's lots of different species of lichen. So this is a nice close-up of an encrusting lichen that you're just going to find on a rock here. They grow really slowly, so any damage to a lichen could be hundreds of years old, that particular lichen, so leave them be, let them kind of chill in their environment. And some of them are indicator species, so depending on your air quality or your water quality, the associations of certain lichens might say, hey, something's not quite right with our air quality, if you're seeing a whole bunch of a particular type of lichen. Another beneficial relationship of fungi is called mycorrhizae. So this is where the hyphae of the fungus actually grows into the roots. So here we have the root itself of the plant. Sometimes they grow into the cells. Sometimes they just grow in between the cells. So in either way, what they're doing is they're helping to bring in nutrients and water and help the plant get access to those things more than they would with their own root structures, because you're going to have a whole bunch of surface area with these mycorrhizae and the hyphae, and then the plants get to take advantage of that. And then the fungi benefits because they get some of the sugar that's stored in the roots. Another symbiotic relationship would be endophytes, some parasitic, some beneficial. Your book doesn't talk too much about them, but these are fungi that actually live inside the plant's stems and leaves. So we can see a little hyphae, little blue snaky looking thing inside the big rectangular plant cell shape. And then we have the benefit of what's called saprophytic. Saprophytes are like our decomposers. So they decompose, break down organic material and release those nutrients back into the ecosystem. Like all of our other decomposers in our ecosystems, it's really important that they do their job, because without it, a lot of the nutrients in dead things would just stay locked in a dead tree or locked in a dead organism. And so these decomposers break that down, releasing all of those organic nutrients back into the ecosystem that then can be utilized by other organisms. Some effects on humans. So we have fungal diseases that can affect our bodies, like we can have fungal, like athlete's foot or ringworm, which is a fungal infection, yeast infections. They can cause disease. They can affect our crops. So here's corn and here's wheat. I think some of these diseases, smut and rust, are some fungal infections that can impact our agriculture. We do have some beneficial, this is the cordyceps right here. This is a parasitic fungus on a pest insect. So some integrative pest management companies are looking for maybe potential fungal treatments of pests instead of using pesticides or chemical treatments that organisms can get resistant to. We can benefit from some of our human diseases by how fungi can attack some of our vectors. So in the protists chapter, we talked about malaria being one of the parasites that kills millions of people every year. It is transmitted by a mosquito. So there are some fungi that can attack and kill the mosquito that causes malaria, which helps protect human lives. I had already mentioned yeast infections. A lot of times they can be treated by antifungal medications and creams if it's like a skin infection. Negative impacts of fungi on humans is they can be toxic. Right, so this is our Amanita mushroom, produces very poisonous toxins that you don't want to just go and like, oh, there's a mushroom, I'm going to eat it. Don't even touch mushrooms unless you know 100% sure what you're doing. There are some, so like rye produces a disease called ergot, that if you were to consume rye that has ergot on it, it can have some neurotoxins that can affect your brain. Aspergillus is highly toxic and has some carcinogenic compounds. So some fungi can be actually pretty poisonous or toxic to humans. One of the great benefits of a lot of our fungi is antibiotics. So antibiotics are medicines that can kill bacteria, usually the pathogenic bacteria we're trying to get rid of. So penicillium mold produced penicillin, which was the first recognized antibiotic by Alexander Fleming in 1929, I believe, so coming up on almost 100 years for that. Cyclosporin is also a product of fungus, which helps for transplant patients. It helps to suppress the immune system so we don't get rejections. And lastly, fungus help to contribute to our gastronomy. It helps with making food such as bread. Yeast helps our bread rise. Yeast is what ferments sugars into alcohols. We can get fungi in our cheese production. So these fermenting mushrooms, not mushrooms necessarily, yeasts and other fungi help us to produce foods that we enjoy, and we can eat them. We can actually just eat the mushroom themselves. They actually have some good nutrients for us. All right, that wraps up our discussion about fungi. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.